It's very hard, it seems, to account for consciousness within a purely material world, because consciousness just seems to be a completely different kind of thing to matter. If you understand matter as being something independent of mind, something that operates in purely law-like, mechanical kinds of ways, and at some point recently, in the last couple of years, I think, the neuroscientist admitted defeat, paid the amount of money that it was to David Chalmers, and this was this sort of great philosopher beat scientist sort of moment.
You can't trust your mind as a mere byproduct of evolution to truthfully lead you to the conclusion that evolution is true.
So I think then if he's attacking only a particular metaphysics that takes evolution to be the full story of the emergence of human reasoning, then I'd agree with him. Believing in resurrection is not an aberration. It's a natural outworking of how things are. Imagine Richard Dawkins and I sit down and we're discussing ontology, which is the question of what exists. I get my pad of paper, he gets his. We start writing down the things we think exists. And for a while, we're just perfectly still. Oh yeah, I think chairs exist, so do you. I think atoms exist, so do you. I think blah, 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 blah. And then he puts his pen down and I go, hang on a minute. I'm going to add on demons. I'm going to add on angels. I'm going to add on heaven. I'm going to add on the Holy Spirit or whatever. And then the idea is, well, we agree about so much and now we're just disagreeing about these extra things. I think that is, if that's the way in which you set up the question, I think whatever you're proving there is some kind of idealist, some kind of something that is less than God. It has to just be an idea. It has to be a concept.
I feel like if we were to start from just establishing what you see as being problematic or limited in explanation within materialism as a jumping off point, and then, well, if there's an explanatory gap from materialism to reality as it is, then where are people going from there? Because that's what I'm seeing a lot on my end, is that more and more people seem to be open to idealism or panpsychism or whatever the case might be. And it kind of feels like the Wild West. I'm talking at a lay person level. I know philosophers, it's a different thing, but the sense that I get from being in like TikTok live streams or just talking to friends or online communities and that type of thing is that people seem quite open to something else beyond matter or some kind of higher power or force or something. And I think that intuition or instinct is interesting. And I also think that from my assessment, it seems to be a cultural moment that we're in right now where something is shifting.
So there are sort of several different reasons why the materialist, or what's now more typically called physicalist, sort of metaphysics is sort of coming apart. So on the one hand, there's the stuff coming out of philosophy of mind, which is that it's very hard, it seems, to account for consciousness within a purely material world. Because consciousness just seems to be a completely different kind of thing to matter. If you understand matter as being something independent of mind, something that operates in purely law-like, mechanical kinds of ways, there's lots of features of conscious experience that just are very hard to fit into that way of understanding the world. So I'm happy to talk about that. That's one area where there's been a lot of sort of fruitful discussion about how then to account for consciousness. Now, you can look this up. I'm not exactly too sure when it was, but a number of years ago, and this may have been what's caused this sort of tipping point to occur now. A number of years ago, there was a bet placed between a very famous, I think maybe even prize-winning neuroscientist, and David Chalmers, who was a philosopher who was famously sort of put forward what's called the hard problem of consciousness. Actually, it's a problem that had been known about for a long time, but he kind of marketed it well and made it kind of famous, which is how do you go from a material description of the world to say why there is also consciousness happening as well. Now, they had a bet. The neuroscientist sort of said, we'll have nailed consciousness within a certain period of time. And Chalmers says, no, you can't. In principle, it's impossible from a neuroscientific point of view to account for it. And at some point recently, in the last couple of years, I think, the neuroscientist admitted defeat, paid the amount of money that it was to David Chalmers. And this was this sort of great philosopher beat scientist sort of moment. The neuroscientist now starts to research consciousness quite a bit, recognizing that it's its own thing. So there's that question: how do we account for consciousness within a material world? Now, from talking to academics that work in this area, from what I understand, is that the purely reductive project there is not very fashionable anymore, and that a lot of the cool kids are working on something like panpsychism. So panpsychism is the idea that, well, you can't account for consciousness within a material world, so there needs to be consciousness there already in matter. So the kind of basic view is that you don't just have the kind of fundamental properties that quantum physics talks about, quantum mechanics talks about, like charge, mass, spin, and so on. You also have this extra property, this extra thing called consciousness that is in there from the beginning. It's been there since the Big Bang in matter, and it's only our kind of lived form of consciousness is when these consciousness properties sort of arrange themselves in the right kind of way in life forms. Now, I think that's, in some ways, in my opinion, it's sort of the death rattle of the physicalist program, and it's coming at things from the wrong way. It's basically saying our general view of the world is correct, a materialist world that operates according to laws and principles, and it evolves along with these sorts of principles in this process. And consciousness does the same. It starts off in these sort of proto forms, and now it has sort of become more complex as the game goes on. But firstly, I don't think there are lots of problems philosophically about how that could work just in the philosophy of mind program, to do with, well, how do these properties add up to become what we experience as conscious inner life? But also, it doesn't, I think, explain the other two reasons why the physicalist program is not enough, which I haven't talked about yet, but I will in a minute. One is about how we could know anything about the world. So this is a question about how our mind and the world interact in knowledge. And secondly, where meaning and values and things come from as well. Because basically panpsychism is just physics supplemented, or with this added notion of consciousness tacked onto it.
I just want to get clarity on one thing that you said, because as I have been looking into panpsychism, it does seem like just adding the property of like a mental property into matter. But in that sense, it almost still feels materialistic or physicalist in nature, but just we're going to tag on this new property or this new attribute called consciousness, but we're still working off of the assumption that like the vast majority of everything that exists is material in nature. In a sense, it doesn't seem to address the original problem, which, if I understand it right, is not only a problem of mind emerging from matter, but it is a problem of what seems to be the fundamentally different kind of thing that consciousness is from matter. So if I get that part right, then how is simply applying consciousness, sort of buttering it over the entire bread, a solution to that distinctiveness?
I think so. So traditionally, if you think there is such a thing as matter, and you think there is also such a thing as mind, you go back to, say, Descartes, the answer was, well, these are just two different substances in the world. You have mental stuff and you have material stuff. And then the question is, how do they interact? Why do we have these two different substances? Is there any way to get a sort of the unity of the whole of reality that way? So I think panpsychism tries to avoid two substances by basically saying there's one underlying substance. You could call that matter, but in some ways you could say it's neither matter nor mind, it's something neutral, but it has material properties or physical properties of charge, mass, and spin, but it also has mental properties, this other kind of property that's irreducible to the physical properties, which we're going to call consciousness or something of that sort. So you now have a kind of property that's sort of inbuilt into the extended material world that you then have to explain how the sort of simple kind of that property that exists in electrons and so on kind of gather together to become consciousness of the sort we know and love. But the reason why you don't want to typically say there are two different kinds of substances is to avoid some of the problems that I mentioned that people have with the dual substances point of view. But you still basically have property dualism. There are two different kinds of properties, physical and mental.
Does this actually help with qualia or the idea that I'm having a first person experience? I'm basically having a human experience, as are you. And in some sense, the distinctiveness of both of our experiences, would panpsychism posit that the entire system is having its own first person experience? Like, aren't we somehow clearly different than the chairs that we're sitting in and the tables that are in front of us? And if you're going to say, no, we're only different by degree or something, then I don't feel that I understand. Like, are we saying that the table is also having a first person experience, or how would on panpsychism you still parse out what I would call like personhood or agency, or not just like consciousness in this abstract quantum realm, like, oh, we saw something vibrate and we think that it's conscious, but oh, that is a human agent, and that is the chair that they're sitting on, and we can see that those are different categories of things. Would panpsychism say, actually, no, the differentiation there is an illusion? They're the same kind of thing fundamentally, the human and the chair that they're sitting on, or maybe I'm missing the point entirely. How would you kind of explain like agency and personhood on panpsychism?
I think the idea is, instead of talking in terms of agency, then the idea is there is something that it is like. There's something it is like to be Brandon. There's something it is like to be a bat. But then there is also something it is like to be an electron. And then the idea is that this sort of idea of something it is like to be, we can get to sort of more complex forms of conscious experience that would involve things like agency, ultimately, something like the capacity for reasoning and reflection, by making this sort of very basic, simplistic notion of what it's like to be more and more complex through some kind of account of how that could work.
To me, that seems almost like a different emergent problem. Like, it's not a problem of emergence from matter to mind, but it's a problem of something, if you say at the most basic level, is the same, but it's so like we are so different than the chairs that we're sitting on, that I at least have a lot of questions about how we could emerge from the same type of substance as the chairs. But that's just me. I'm curious. I'm pushing you on panpsychism. You're not a panpsychist. Why are you not a panpsychist? And kind of where do we go from here as we're kind of narrowing down from materialism into your actual view, which I'm very curious about.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. And I'm happy to talk about it. I will say one thing a little bit on what you just said before on panpsychism, though. I suppose the thought is that, yes, I am very different to the chair, but then presumably I'm also very different to an ant in terms of my conscious experience. I'm certainly very different to blue-green algae or simple cell organisms and so on. But if you have a kind of reality, a sort of objective, independent, world-first way of understanding everything, and you think you have a good enough story in evolutionary theory and cosmology to go from sort of the singularity of a Big Bang right up to now, you continue with that story, but you just add in not only the increasing complexification of matter that leads to human bodies, but you have to tell a similar story with the consciousness property, such that these basic consciousness properties through evolution and so on complexify to become the kind of experience we have. But still, it seems to me that if you have what I would call a bottom-up ontology, so if you think that reality is fundamentally bits of matter, particles or something of that sort that gather together in more and more complex structures, there still is the question of how can these very basic rudimentary bits of electron consciousness and proton consciousness become the kind of unified experience that we have, certainly as humans, but even other kind of animal life forms. So that is a problem with kind of bottom-up panpsychism. I'm not familiar with, it's obviously a problem that anyone working in this area is very aware of. There are no doubt attempted solutions to that problem. I haven't massively looked into it because of the reason that you said. For me, this is a way of trying to avoid what I think is the complete revolution of the way of understanding reality, which is not to begin from the outside and then try to explain the inner world, as if there's some kind of out there objective world that we have to understand our own subjective experience in terms of, but to flip things the other way around and to interpret the world in terms of starting from a kind of inside out, from a position of the ultimate reality of conscious experience in its most broad, complex form. So it involves agency right off the bat. It involves our sense experience, but actually my kind of idealism, and I'll explain what idealism is in a minute, is a broad kind. So it involves thought, it involves feeling, it involves emotions. It also involves moral conscience and everything like that. Idealism is the view that reality is ultimately mental or spirit in nature. So people used to say spirit, Hegel, and so on. Now people tend to talk in terms of the mental, but they're very similar. The idea is that reality is fundamentally kind of personal in nature. So what that means is you don't end up in the dualist position of Descartes, well, there's matter and then there's mind. You actually, whereas the materialism of old rejected mind entirely and said, well, we can somehow explain what mind is just in terms of matter. Mind is nothing more than matter. It's just the brain. It's just organic organism, processes of organism that somehow appears to be something different, but it's not really. It's fully reducible. Idealism reduces things the other way around. The other way. It says, look, matter isn't a fundamental thing. It doesn't have any kind of independent existence of mind. That doesn't mean that there's no difference between me and a chair, because a chair is just mind. What it means is that there's a difference between a subject or what I would call a finite center of experience, which is what we are as humans, and the contents of that experience. So a chair is something that is the content of an experience of a mind or minds. It isn't something that's capable of independent existence from minds the way we sort of traditionally would understand matter to be.
I wanted to just briefly note that I loved your conversation with Dr. Samir Varma. I thought that was fantastic. And he is a physicist, materialist, and yet the way that he talks about reality is such that the ultimate explanation for everything are quantum fields interacting with each other in a totally deterministic way, all the way up to us. And I just wanted to note that because it reminds me a lot of the description that you just gave on panpsychism, but with just a different flavoring. But where if everything is one type of substance and it's just varying degrees of complexity, or you could add in a Darwinian theory to explain how that happens or whatever. But I think the description that you just gave sort of supports my view of panpsychism, which is, yes, it is different than materialism, but it seems to make a similar case to that case that was made in your podcast with Dr. Varma, where there's a different kind of thing that across time becomes every kind of thing in varying degrees, but there at least seems to be some overlap there in terms of explanation. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd say there's a lot in that. I think that one of the ways in which I would diverge from panpsychism is what we've talked about, which is that I think panpsychism still is attempting to explain the inside of our conscious experience in terms of things we take to be outside experience and objective, even if they have certain properties. So they're still sort of taking the scientific story as the starting point and then trying to interpret who we are or our own subjective experience in how do we fit into this story that science is telling. So they're taking science in a very realist fashion. So that's one way. Whereas I want to sort of say, let's not try to shoehorn consciousness or agency or subjective experience into a fundamentally objective theory of science. We start there and we interpret science as merely a subset or a way of describing an aspect of human experience. So I agree with the theories of physics, but I think they're merely there to explain some of the things we experience through our senses, but there's so much more to subjective experience than that. So that's one area. The other area I think is something you're touching on right there, which is that another assumption in that worldview is that reality is ultimately a plurality. That reality, the true nature of reality, is going on at the level of the very tiny, at the level of the very small. And that anything on the larger scales, like a human body or human experience, is nothing but kind of the sum total of what's happening at this level of the very, very tiny. Now, that idea, it's really hard to shake, and sometimes we're not even aware that that's an assumption of how we're thinking. But the idealists and the idealist positions that I favor want to say that that is wrong. No, if you want to understand reality, you have to begin at the level of the whole. And you understand the parts of the whole in terms of their place within the whole as a system. Now, these are debates. I mean, it depends how long we have to talk, but these are debates that were so crucial to what was happening in the 19th century with the emergence of these new sciences. And it just seems like the importance of the questions of, if everything is loose and separate, as sort of the philosopher David Hume thought and was picked up by the philosophers who are trying to follow the scientific method, where does unity come from? Where does unity of thought come from? Where does unity of experience come from? Where does unity of the universe come from? That's very difficult to account for. And actually, that story is coming apart even in the physics world, because we're now understanding things like entanglement and other features like this that make it very hard to think you bottom out and then you can construct upwards that way. No, I think that these sort of posits of particles are objects we get when we analyze what is going on at higher levels. And so you're talking about the debate I had with Samir Varma. So he it's because he started off by saying something like, every physicist knows that all areas are the particles of standard model physics or something like that. And I'm
quantum fields interacting with each other.
Could be quantum. It depends. Yeah, quantum fields or fundamental particles, depending on which way you interpret it. Well, I don't think every physicist does know that. I think it's a working assumption of physics that they are the things in which you explain other things. But that's a very different thing to say that that's all there is. For example, a mathematician isn't going to explain things in terms of buses and trains. They're going to explain things in terms of numbers, but they would never think, therefore, everything is numbers. Some might, but typically you just take the entities of your theory or the entities within that you use to explain things in your discipline as a discipline-specific method or as a discipline-specific thing. But there is this sort of, for me, entirely incorrect view that physics is sort of the queen of the sciences that explains everything, and the other disciplines or other modes of understanding are would eventually come out in the wash once our physics has sort of reached its point of completion. And that's an assumption. I think it's an assumption that's coming apart. It's an assumption that's very wrong. And incidentally, the best, for me, philosophers of science who are trying to answer this question are moving away from what we would call scientific realism, which is the idea that the things that exist are the things science talks about. Even they want to say science is special, science is important. I'd agree with them. But it's important not because it tells you what the fundamental nature of reality is, but it's important because it has a codified method that is capable of self-improvement and getting closer to something that helps us in terms of technology and get things done. It's things that help us get things done more than give us insight into the ultimate nature of things.
So I, interestingly, also loved your conversation with Dr. Kastrup, who is, I believe, an analytic idealist.
Yeah.
And it didn't seem that you guys agreed on everything either at all, although you're both types of idealists. But it seems like maybe here we should say, okay, if everyone is questioning, if some people are trending toward explanations of reality that are not reductive in a total physicalist, materialist sense, then we've hit on panpsychism, but what does the landscape look like in terms of idealism, types of idealism? What else is on the table right now? And how would you, I guess, sort of distinguish your view from some other models of idealism?
Okay, fantastic question. So yeah, I mean, I'm a fan of Kastrup and what he's doing, because he's articulate, he's good at explaining things, and he's developing a bit of a following in the public domain. And I think that's got to be a good thing, helping people realize there are alternative ways of interpreting reality. However, where I differ from him is that he still seems to be in the same kind of lane as panpsychism, in that his justification for his idealism is drawing still a lot from scientific theory. So he does say at some moments that he is what I would call an anti-realist about science. In other words, he thinks that the laws of science just explain the phenomenal world, the things that we experience. They don't tell you how things are independently of the way we experience things. But on the flip side, he still seems to interpret who we are, drawing on evolutionary concepts and things of that sort. So he isn't asking what I take to be the fundamental questions, or at least if he is asking that, I haven't encountered that. And I think when we discuss some of those more fundamental questions, he seemed to me to be thinking on the fly a little bit. So, for example, the other things that I talked about that could be motivations for idealism, not just how do we account for consciousness within the world from the objective standpoint, but how do we make sense of our knowledge of the world? How do we make sense of the nature of truth? How do we make sense of the nature of ethics? So, for example, for Kastrup, he has an idealist framework. In other words, he thinks that reality is ultimately mind. He calls it mind at large. And that we are what he calls alters of mind at large. We're basically like disassociated alters. That is what used to be thought of as split personalities. We're kind of personalities of this mind at large interacting, but we're all part of this mind. But that this mind is not metacognitive. It's not like us. It doesn't have the capacity to reflect on itself. It doesn't have its own desires. It doesn't have its own will. So it's a very, unlike a sort of a theistic idealism, which would have mind at large being kind of a more advanced or superior kind of mind or person than we are. It's almost like a less advanced. I mean, he might dispute my terminology that way, but it seems to be, he does say it's not metacognitive. It's not able to reflect on its own experience and to kind of evaluate itself. It just does. He says mind at large is what it does because it is what it is. So it's quite a mechanistic. And that's part of his desire, I think, to still be a naturalist and a reductivist. So he's still taking up a lot of what I would call the normative that drives the values that science values. Let's explain everything in terms of a few things. And let's keep everything kind of unfolding naturally. Let's not import other things into it.
Have you ever heard him give an explanation for all like particular instantiations or like personalities of a collective consciousness that exist? But if there isn't a, I guess, unifying source or principle for that consciousness, that we're sort of in the image of a singular, mind of God. And I'm just trying to understand how, if that's wrong, basically he would say that's wrong. We're not created after or created by or derived from or made in the image of a God, a divine mind, but we exist like collectively as that mind. I guess it's a question of how are we consistently the same thing, or I guess what is like, do you need a unifying principle? I don't know if that's the right term.
So one of the problems I thought with the idea that we are disassociated alters of mind at large, yes, and yet we have a metacognitive reflective experience that mind at large doesn't have. I said, well, that to me doesn't make sense, because imagine a worm had a dissociative alter. I can't imagine that dissociated alter suddenly having mental capacities the worm didn't have. It doesn't seem to me as though a dissociated alter could be a kind of mental experience that's very different. So I quizzed him on this, and it seemed as though, if I were understanding his theory correctly, if I am fundamentally a mind, and if that mind was produced or brought forth from mind at large, then my mind is actually not an offshoot of my parents' mind, but it's an offshoot of mind at large. Because his explanation was that the reason why our minds have these additional features to them is because we have had to evolve. So our minds have kind of evolved due to the need to survive. Mind at large doesn't need to survive. It just is. It's the entirety of everything. So it hasn't had the evolutionary pressures to kind of evolve from a sort of, you might think of a simple mind like a newt, up to a more complex rational mind like we are, but we have had to because we're on the earth. But then I was saying, how can the evolutionary story still make sense given that I am an offshoot of mind at large, not of my parents' mind? It's not like my parents have a dissociated experience.
Right.
So to me, I still think that's a problem. The answer he gave me in our interview was relatively metaphorical. He talked about my mind being a sort of spin-off of my parents' mind, that like eddies in a stream, there may be these other whirlpools that sort of spin off. So he seemed to sort of suggest that there was some way in which I am an offshoot of my parents' mind, which is how the evolutionary change in mind could accrue. Because in the evolutionary account, obviously, you need sort of changes in the DNA to be passed on genetically through inheritance. But if you're not telling the story at the level of bodies, telling at the level of minds, I still find it hard. How is it that mind itself could evolve in a way independent of mind at large if the individual people are alters of mind at large? So he did give an answer. I might not be remembering it exactly correctly. I remember I didn't find it particularly satisfying, but we did move on. If people want to see how he responded to that, you could look at our first conversation. But for me, again, these problems all emerge from Kastrup's kind of idealism, because he's still putting sort of the scientific story front and center. So he's still wanting to use evolution to explain other aspects, he uses theories like Carl Friston's theory about membranes and so on to explain why our experiences are not of reality directly. And this, I suppose, was the core thing that I found dissatisfying about the Kastrup's form of idealism. It was better than panpsychism, I think, but it still was taking the sort of science as the bedrock way of then trying to interpret things. And I guess maybe the idealism that I favor is a little more revolutionary than that. It wants to say, let's not look to science to understand the deep nature of reality. Let's have a different basis of our metaphysics. Let's look for a way of trying to understand reality that doesn't assume something like the scientific method, which is a very new way of doing philosophy. It's part of the analytic tradition, which is why it's calling it analytic idealism. But that emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century as a project to sort of brush away some of the seemingly superstitious or religious elements in philosophy and kind of try and ground philosophy in something respectable, a bit more like science, a bit more clear cut in what's true and what's false, and get rid of any of this sort of speculative stuff. Whereas certainly in Britain and in parts of America and other parts of the Commonwealth, the kind of idealism there was saying that these sciences are all great, but metaphysics is prior to that. These are only true within a small scope. Let's not suddenly shift allegiance to that. And then they still had a rigorous methodology for how we understand reality, but it was quite different. And this really, when you understand it, it ties into all sorts of debates that again, it solves the knowledge question for me. It solves the nature of truth question. It solves morality. It solves so much. But it does mean, well, I'll tell you what it means. Just a little bit of a spoiler, I suppose. It means that all of these other kinds of concepts that are assumed or bedrock or fundamental to the scientific explanation of the world. So things like the reality of time, the reality of causation, how mathematics works to explain the regularity and the descriptive regularity of the laws. All of that is seen as having to be interpreted itself in terms of our subjective experiences agents, in terms of rationality. So rationality and feeling and agency are the starting points from which you explain what causation is, from which you explain what time is, from which you explain what truth is. And then the stories of science and the truths of science sort of are quite far down the road of how you understand reality. So the problem, I think, with the Kastrupian idealism is the same kind of problem that we have with materialism or with panpsychism. They're starting from a point too far down the road, and then they're trying to get back to the starting point. They're trying to get back to truth and knowledge and consciousness. They're trying to draw that out of the scientific account. Whereas I think we need to interpret the scientific account and matter and everything else from from something more fundamental, which would be personal in nature.
This reminds me of Alvin Plantinga has an interesting thing about if evolution is optimizing for fitness and basically survival and sexual reproduction, but not truth, then the content of the thought inside of anything's mind could be true or not. It doesn't matter so long as their behavior is working towards fitness. That is what evolution will select for. He gives the example of a frog. As long as the frog shoots its tongue out and grabs the fly and brings it in, that behavior will be advantageous to the survival of that frog. But it could be thinking about Tolstoy, or it could be thinking about nothing. It doesn't matter. Or it could be thinking that the fly is actually a UFO. It literally doesn't matter the truthfulness of the thought of the frog. The only thing that matters is the behavior. And I think that this kind of ties into what you're saying about what is upstream and what is downstream. If we're meant to trust that our minds are capable of bringing us to truth, and if the reason that we're meant to trust that is because we're the byproduct of evolution, and sort of that's been like we've adapted for that, we've adapted towards truth because it's helpful to survival. I don't know your thoughts on this, but I thought his argument, when I finally got it, was really helpful in realizing actually there's nothing about evolution that's going to help us trust that our minds can bring us to truth. In fact, you could even go one step further and say maybe poor ideas somehow are useful, like illusions or delusions that somehow cause us to act in a way that is advantageous for survival. But maybe in a sense, we must believe, I mean, now I'm stretching it further, but we must believe untrue things in a sense that helps us sustain an illusion that's good for our survival. Like there's no correlation between the two.
Okay. Yeah. Fantastic. Good thing to bring up. So this is Plantinga is really just pointing to a long-standing debate over the nature of truth. What happened in the 19th century was so radical and disruptive to the very way in which we understood everything, the way in which we understood the nature of the world, that the Bible as an authority in Genesis is being undermined by the fossil record, by dinosaur bones, by textual criticism as well. We were starting to interpret the Bible differently, looking at who was the author, why did they say that, what were their intent, and so on. And then evolutionary theory started to say, we are not fallen creatures, we are risen creatures, right? There was no perfect bliss that we've fallen from. And actually everything that we are is just as a product of survival. Well, it was very obvious to people at the time that logic was under threat, because before we thought the reason we could understand the nature of reality, like from Newton and these other sort of scientists, is because God had given us reason as a gift that was related to his own mind, and his own mind was what created the world. But if you now thought that we didn't have a mind separate, but that our mind had emerged, and people were then wondering whether God even existed, part of the death of God that Nietzsche later talks about, how do we make sense of truth? How do we make sense of some way of our mind connecting to a reality beyond it? So the pragmatist approach to truth came out saying that the problem isn't that we don't have any capacity to reach truth, we just have usefulness. The problem is that we think truth is anything except usefulness. All truth is usefulness. So they would reject that view, would reject the Plantinga position by saying that there is not, you're deluded to think there is something called truth that is separate from what would be useful or what could be justified for, and so on. So you take the frog example. The idea would be that, yeah, sure, if the frog believed that inside his tummy was the land of the flies and his job was to rescue those that had escaped and bring them back to bliss, that would produce the behavior just as useful for the frog's survival. So there's no fact of the matter as to which is true. But the thing is, this also undermines science. Like imagine we take a Newtonian view of gravity as a force that attracts all objects. Obviously, Einstein's view is slightly more sophisticated, but let's stick with that. If I had the alien theory of gravity instead, which is that inside objects there exist these greedy aliens, little goblin aliens, that love things. And the more mass an object has, the more of these little goblins, invisible goblins, live in it. And when they see any other mass, they run out and grab it and try and pull it into their houses. Like, I could flesh out the greedy goblin theory, and it would give me exactly the same results as Newtonian force, for example. So that you could think then, as far as the sums are concerned or the predictions are concerned, again, there's no separate truth to be had. And so often philosophers accept that, and they'll say things like, not only is there nothing called truth that's separate to usefulness, there's also nothing in terms of meaning separate to how that meaning would affect behavior. That the only way I can understand what you mean is if I know how I could verify it, what could justify it, and how it affects your behavior. So I think that is the position you're brought to if you disagree with if you sort of disagree with this idea of there being truth separate to usefulness. However, the idealist, and going back to the same idealist that I like, the idealist that I like was sitting there saying, truth is something separate to usefulness, because usefulness is part of the domain of action. Truth is something to do with the domain of the intellect. It's to do with understanding. It's to do with knowledge. And it doesn't just end up at usefulness. Here's partly why. If truth is usefulness, you pretty much struggle to maintain the objectivity of truth. Because what's useful to you to believe and what's useful to me to believe could be different, and they could be contradictory, but then they end up being true. So, for example, William James, who was one of the early pragmatists and American, he admitted that truth was relative. It doesn't mean truth is subjective. It just means truth is relative. You could still be wrong, but you could be right in believing one thing and I could believe something contradictory. We're both true. So, for example, it can be very useful. If you ask people how intelligent they think they are on a scale of 1 to 10, most people say something like 7, right? That cannot be true. It cannot be the case that everyone is slightly above average or lots of people are slightly above average intelligence. But we all like to think of ourselves as slightly above average in most things. And the psychologists will come and say, yeah, well, it's very useful to believe that you're slightly above average, because if you didn't, you wouldn't bother trying hard. You wouldn't think well of yourself. That there are all these useful lies. If it's useful for everybody to think they're above average intelligence, then it must be true that everyone is slightly above average intelligence, which is, if we're taking him from a mathematical point of view, that just is impossible, right?
Or to your thing about the goblins inside of every planet, like there either are or are not actually goblins inside of every planet. And if you think that there are and you're right, you're right. If you think that there aren't and there are, then you're wrong. Those are mutually exclusive truth claims that, regardless of the utility of the belief and the implications of the theory as you parse it out mathematically as an alternative to Newtonian physics, there either literally are or are not goblins in the planet, and one of those is right.
Well, there is, if you think that there is a way of things in reality independent of the way we think about it, or independent of the way we talk about it. But this is where you have these sorts of, what I take of these three very different ways of interpreting the world. The two that we kind of have in play at the moment are the kind of, what I think of as the realism, which is the idea that there is this world out there of facts. Things are really thus and so. Whether or not we could ever know how they are. This is linked to a view of truth called the correspondence theory of truth. The idea is that if I say there are goblins in matter, that's true if and only if in the world out there, independently of how we talk and think about it, there really are some entities called goblins living in them or not, right? So that's a correspondence theory of truth, and it's linked very much to this way of interpreting the world in the scientific way of the world is out there, it is the way it is, and it's our job to replicate that in the way we talk and think. That's realism. The opposite one that's often in play now is the pragmatism one, where they say, no, look, the world doesn't have these facts out there. That's ridiculous. That takes the world to be too much framed by our language and our thinking. The world just is itself. We have no access to this supposed world independently of the way we talk and think about it. The only way in which we interact with that world is through trying to do things. When I try and act on my beliefs or my thoughts, it works or it fails. And that's all that there is. There is no additional story to be told. So scientific laws are true because they're useful, because they allow us to build iPhones, they allow us to do these things. Don't look for anything over and above usefulness. That is all truth is. So the Plantinga position is saying that no, usefulness and truth are genuinely different notions or different normative things to aim at. If evolution was the only account you had, you can't get to anything more than usefulness or more than what is practical for survival. So you shouldn't believe evolutionary theory because it's not true. That means evolutionary theory isn't true. The flip side to it is thoroughgoing pragmatists will accept that.
Just to be fair to Plantinga, I believe his position was you can't be both a materialist and believe in evolutionary theory as a legitimate conduit towards truth. I think that was his point. You can't hold both of those consistently. Like, you can't trust your mind as a mere byproduct of evolution to truthfully lead you to the conclusion that evolution is true.
Okay, so I think then if he's attacking only a particular metaphysics that takes evolution to be the full story of the emergence of human reasoning, then I'd agree with him. And this is linked with something that I've actually have a video on my channel about, which is the self-refuting arguments against causal determinism. It's linked with the similar kind of thing. It's like, if we are capable of knowing evolutionary theory is true, then we have to be the sort of thing that couldn't have merely evolved. Because similarly, if we're the sort of thing that can't have free will, we can't genuinely deliberate and distinguish truth from falsity and reasoning. Yes. Equally, we can't reach truth. This was again was a debate that played out. Is logic just psychology? If you're in evolution, if you interpret our existence in purely evolutionary terms, you only have psychology. You don't have logic, because logic is just ways in which we think, which is just psychology. We just happen to think that way. We've evolved to think that way. There's nothing eternal or ultimately objective about logic even, right? It's just how we happen to think. So if you take the evolutionary story to be the only account and everything to do with our inner life has been geared purely for survival, yes, truth, reason, logic, these things kind of drop away. Yeah. But you can bite the bullet, as I'm saying. You can go full-blown pragmatist. You wouldn't be a materialist, strictly speaking. You just say, well, I don't know what the ultimate nature of reality is. And it's not the job of science or anything like that to tell you what the ultimate nature of reality is. It's just the job of science to come up with descriptions that if we act upon them, we do better. We manage to build better technology, keep away diseases, produce more food. So basically, you take that evolutionary story right through to our reasoning processes. Our reasoning processes should be evaluated, again, purely in terms of how useful they are, how much they contribute to survival, but not how much they kind of match up to some reality ultimately independent of human practice.
The fact that people are using it this regularly and the fact that we now know how bad it is creates a significant problem. This is an email that I got from a subscriber of this YouTube channel. I've been hoping to find something like this for a while. One morning a few weeks ago, I prayed to God to send some help. A couple hours later, I heard an ad for this app. I immediately downloaded it. It has been everything I was looking for. Relay is a community-based app to help you on your porn-free journey. There's a lot of different features in Relay that make it effective. I want you to check it out for yourself in the link in the description below. It gives you daily accountability, evidence-based skills, and a supportive community that will enable you to break free from the porn cycle if you are currently caught in one. And like I said, the statistics around the amount of people that are frankly horrifying. So that's why I care about this. Relay is so confident, in fact, that you will see results in 30 days, that they will give you a money back guarantee if you don't. So there really is no downside to this in that sense if you are currently trapped in pornography and want to get out. If Relay works for you, amazing, absolutely worth it. If for whatever reason it doesn't, you don't lose any money. Don't keep this in the shadows anymore. Don't punt it to your future self to solve. Take a stand today. Let this be the day that things change for you. Click the link in the description. Use my code WISDOM to get 7 days free. Join Relay if you're struggling. Thank me later. Now back to the video.
Panpsychism is an improvement on materialism. It recognizes that consciousness is not reducible to matter. So it's taking consciousness much more seriously. Idealism is better than panpsychism because it starts already at the whole, in some sense, of conscious experience. It doesn't think that conscious experience is just simple things connected together in the right kind of way to be complex. It's taking the unity of conscious experience seriously. Pragmatism I like, in as much as it rejects the idea that there is a reality out there that is independent of the way we think about it, independent of the way we talk about it. I don't think that's the case. I think that the world is, at least the world interacts with us in the terms that we bring to it. So it talks back to us in the concepts that we have. It talks back to us in the language that we can understand. And I think that is part of, I mean, if I go more sort of theological language, is part of the grace of God, that he is able to get down on our level and communicate with us in ways that we can understand. But the ultimate nature of reality is not structured in the way in which we currently think or talk about it. Ultimate reality is of a form that just blows our understanding and the categories of our understanding completely. And you can say that without any kind of particularly high theology, I think. I think that's really been clear since Kant, that, and it's also part of where I think some sort of progressive politics actually goes right. I mean, I have a lot to disagree with that, but it's right that reality isn't neatly given and structured and parceled up. We do play an active role in structuring and categorizing reality. Okay, so there are all the different things that I like, but where I think they're all impoverished to some degree. So let's put pragmatism to the side. Let's talk about the realist interpretations of all sorts, including the Castruppian one, I would say. They all take the realm of thought, the theories of thought, and what we say about thought to be the gateway of understanding what there is. So in other words, if something is true, then it exists. If I cannot make sense of something, if something doesn't fit within my rational way of interpreting things, then it doesn't exist. In other words, anything that cannot be accounted for within my theory, therefore does not exist. The kind of idealism, I think the main advantage of idealism is that you're saying reality is more than thought. It's more than can be thought. That there are things that by their very nature transcend thought and can only be known in other ways. If you're an idealist, there's a pretty good account of how this is. Philosophers are already familiar with different kinds of knowledge. They'll talk about knowledge by acquaintance, which is, I can have a knowledge of you, Brandon, through our interaction. I can have knowledge of my wife. And that knowledge we have through acquaintance goes beyond all the facts that I might be able to list about you or about my wife. So it's a form of knowledge that is not conceptual, descriptive. It's not purely propositional, right? It's not.
Would it be right to call it experiential?
So, I mean, the idealism that I would defend is going to say reality is experience, yeah, and we'd have different modes of experience. Not all experience is rational. Not all experience is cognitive. Not all experience is thought. There is another kind of encounter, another kind of knowledge we can have, which is knowledge by acquaintance. This is very linked to our aesthetic experience of the world. You can't, you cannot know. I think you can know about reality through doing art, through doing beauty-seeking activities, right? Through our emotions. I'm not Ben Shapiro saying facts don't care about your feelings, as though everything that's real is what we can describe in terms of facts, and that feelings are irrelevant. I don't think they are. I think that we have, if you deny our the aesthetic dimension of human experience, you are denying a major part of what there really is. So that has to be accounted for. So there's the aesthetic dimension. There's also our moral dimension, or the dimension that we have as agents, as willing beings, not merely thinking beings, not merely feeling beings, but also willing beings. When you try to entirely account for agency in a rational way, as though it reduces just to our intellectual categories, it's very, very difficult. you get a shell. You get something. If you're doing it properly, you get something, but it's a shell. So I famously defend free will in a few videos on my channel, and I do put forward a theory of free will, but I don't think that theory fully captures free will. The same way I don't think our scientific theories of time capture time. They famously can't capture the flow of time, for example. So there are aspects to our willing dimension that are not, and moral dimension that cannot be captured in a theory. So then I think it's a mistake to try and recapture morality or recapture aesthetics within a scientific account. Science should just say, look, this is not my domain. Okay, I'm just trying to explain an aspect that is not even the whole of thought. The whole of thought is contained in truth, and you have mathematics and logic. They're not scientifically explainable. They're rational. Science is using those things to interpret our sense experience, the things that come through our eyes, nose, and so on.
I listened to this between two folks. I'll get their name in a second here. And the one person said, okay, you could know imagine someone is born in a blank white room, and then they're just given a book that gives them all of the information about an apple. So they know everything to know about an apple, but they've never seen an apple. And so they were arguing that that when they actually see the apple, there's something that they now know about the apple that they didn't know, even though they knew every other thing about the apple other than actually seeing the apple for themselves. And I think that's what you're saying.
I think that's a version of what's called the Mary argument by Jackson. So he was arguing that there must be more facts than there are physical facts. And he imagines Mary, top-notch scientist, in a black and white room. She knows everything about light waves, everything about the visual system, knows everything there, all the physical facts that there are, she learns and knows. And then the idea is she leaves the room at some point and encounters a red rose and says, that's what red looks like. So the idea is that she knows everything about red, its wavelength. She has the entire scientific story. She knows all the physical facts. But then when she sees the flower, Jackson's conclusion was that she learns a new fact. She learns the fact of what red looks like. Now, this is something you learn under a philosophy degree when you're doing philosophy of mind, which is the question of, does that mean there are non-physical facts? I think the best answer is actually to say, no, it doesn't show that. What it shows that is that there are forms of knowledge that are not knowledge of facts, right?
Well, yeah, that's what I was trying to connect between what you were saying and that. Yeah, exactly.
She now has a different kind of knowledge. She has knowledge by acquaintance, knowledge of by connecting, by being acquainted with redness. That's not knowledge about redness, which the kind of thing she knew before, the intellectual stuff could be. It's a felt experience of redness that she's encountered. But it does show that there are more kinds of knowledge than you get through science. So that does, I think, say that we need a deeper account of the world.
The counter that was given in this, it wasn't really a debate. It was a kind of a back and forth discussion podcast. The counter that was given was ultimately that type of knowledge that you're describing is a type of like a brain state. And if Mary, let's say, was able to manifest that brain state within the room, she would then, even if it's a hallucination or something, she would then have the same type of knowledge as actually seeing the apple or the rose in the real world. So that input or stimuli is simply triggering the thing that we're now calling a new type of knowledge. But if you could get it apart from that stimuli, you'd still have the same thing, which I found to be maybe putting the cart before the horse a little bit in terms of the assumption of the ultimate thing being the brain state and not the interaction of the person with the environment. But I was curious how you might respond to that.
Okay, so I haven't heard that before, but I can see what's being said. So the idea would be that if she knew everything, she would know what brain state coincided with red experiences, and she could artificially stimulate that in herself and would undergo that experience. So yeah, first of all, that would only be the case if you're effectively assuming physicalism. But if the dialectics of the argument are that physicalism is can't sustain this idea, then the physicalist could reply with that. Well, if physicalism is true, then she should be able to do that. However, it depends how we're understanding the idea of knowledge. Presumably, that red experience that she gets, is that knowledge of a fact? She already knew what the brain state was, but now she knows that brain state is correlated with this. And so what's the this thing? Is that doesn't see, either that is nothing more than the physical fact that is, which is the brain state. But she already knew that. She already knew what the brain state was. So what extra knowledge has she gained then? It seems it's still, whether there's a real rose there that triggered that brain state going on and her new knowledge, or whether there wasn't, it was artificial, as a machine with electrodes, to me doesn't make any difference as far as the thought experiment goes. It's still trying to trigger that idea that there is a kind of knowledge that you can only get through experiencing it firsthand, not through experiencing it as a subject, rather than through experiencing it through an objective description. You can describe a brain state, see a picture of a brain state, but it's not the same thing. So I think that any of these sort of thought experiments are designed to really pump the intuition that subjective experience can be broader than what we could objectively describe or we could objectively know. So,
and you're saying even if your subjective experience was tricked, that doesn't matter. Whether there's a fake rose or some other stimuli that's tricking the subjective experience, the fact that it is experiencing something that is very much perceptually like a red rose gets to the same point that you're making regardless. Yeah, and you got to remember, I'm an idealist. I don't really think that there is a material red rose there anyway when we see red roses walking down the street, right? So I don't think you need to say there has to be some causal relation between the rose and the red experience. Now, all I'm saying is, and I think the thought experiment does quite a good job of showing, is that there are aspects of our experience that give us information or knowledge that are not reducible to a description or reducible to a fact that we might express in language or we might codify within a theory. Now, I would change tack a little bit. So there's those philosophical answers which are good, but there's also a lot of evidence in terms of child psychology about this too. I mean, the thought is that infants and babies, they don't experience the world cognitively. They don't experience a difference between themselves and their mother. They don't divide the world up into objects like a hand or a fist, and because their language hasn't yet developed, they experience the ultimate unity of all things before they categorize and divide it up, and that's something that comes later. And when they do that, then they begin to what we call model the world. So here's a really good example of how this plays out. At a certain age, you give a little baby, say a rattle, they're playing with it, and they drop it, they just cry. They just go, ah! Because as soon as they don't see the rattle or feel the rattle, as far as they're concerned, it no longer exists. It's just gone. They're only aware of their immediate experiences, their immediate surrounds. They don't have the concept of time and before and after, any of that stuff. But then at a certain point, you get that same baby a rattle, they're rattling it and they drop it. They don't cry. They bend and look over the pram. Where did it go? Mm-hmm. That's when they're now recognizing there's a world beyond the limits of their immediate experience. And they're modeling what that world would be like in thought. And then they're tracking what happens to things out of their immediate experience within the model they have of the world in their thinking. And they use that model of the world to direct their activity and help them predict what they will see when they look over the pram. Or maybe I'll see the rattle and maybe I'll be able to reach for it. So what that shows, and this is the idealists that I like really draw on this. They say there are different aspects of our experience. We have a kind of raw, unmediated experience of the world that we get through our sense perception, but also through our sense of fear, our pains, our pleasures, that these are all an immediate encounter with reality before it gets structured by our concepts, by our language, by our thinking. The reason we don't take that immediate experience to be the whole of reality is because we encounter its bounds. There's something to that that's unstable. This is what F.H. Bradley said, even in the 19th century. There's something about that's unstable. We recognize its finitude and that there is a world beyond our immediate experience. But how do we get to that world beyond our immediate felt experience? He says, through thought. We abstract features of this experience and we use that to build and construct conceptually
the idea of a world beyond what we're immediately perceiving. To do that, we need to introduce concepts like time, concepts like space, concepts like causation, how things relate to others, that we use to structure and conceptualize a world beyond our experience. And then we use that as a model of how things are to direct our experience and to direct our understanding. And that's where language comes, that's where thought comes, etc. Now, what I think the error is with the realist position that we're talking about is once they've got this world of thought, they say that's the whole world. They deny the original experience, that felt experience from which it came. And they're trying to get this consciousness, this what I'd take to be the primordial part of what it is to be a conscious living being. They're kind of trying to fit that into the world of thought. But it's not. It's the grounds from which thought arises, the grounds from which our concepts and ideas come. Here's where it is, to me, the most erroneous. You look at philosophy of mathematics, look at the work of Frege and some of those people in the, again, 19th century is where it's at. The recognition is that there is nothing in the world that is quantity. Okay? If I give you a pack of cards, a deck of cards, I give you a deck of cards, put it in your hand, and I say, how many things? You don't know. Depends. There are 52. If you say cards, how many cards? 52. How many suits? 4. How many decks? 1. How many jokers? 2, or whatever, right? You cannot give me a quantity until you have a concept, what's called a sortal concept, which gives you instructions about how to count, what things to count, and how to count how many there are. So Frege's insight is that quantity is a property of concepts. It's not a property of the world itself. It's a property of the concepts that we use to divide and structure the world. So it's what he calls a second order concept. Okay, so if that's the case, if quantity is actually a feature of our thinking about the world, you're going somewhere really weird if you then say things like, all we have in our scientific theories is mathematics, everything is just numbers, you go simulation theory, it's all just bits of information. You're already way down the track. No, we encounter the world qualitatively, not quantitatively. We encounter the qualities of the sense, the touches, the taste, the feelings, the stuff that Kastrup actually does a good job at talking about, right? The reality is ultimately qualitative. The quantity is that emerges from our structured way of trying to reach beyond immediate experience to model the world. But where Bradley goes is he says reality cannot be merely the felt experience because it's too finite, it's too limited. Thought allows us to transcend the bounds, but it does so at the cost of detail. It does so at the cost of importing structure and relations into reality that they aren't actually there. It has to use concepts that are contradictory in nature, like time and space. And he has these very interesting arguments for why these are contradictory notions, even though they're useful. So he says there must be some level at which reality is able to rejoin the realm of feeling and the realm of thought, and he thinks the realm of volition, and he calls that the absolute experience, which for him is kind of the consummation of truth, beauty, and goodness. So that's my idealism. It's not one that just says it's all about action and activity, nor is it just about consciousness being added to our purely descriptive theory of the world. It's one that takes our personal engagement with the world and saying reality must be a bit like what I experience, but fully fleshed out in its infinite form. And for me, we encounter where thought in its infinite form would be in the norm of truth. We encounter where reality is an action in the norm of goodness and feeling in the norm of beauty. So I think we encounter the absolute in the values of our aspects of experience. And that would then link to my theology as well.
So you mentioned Bradley, and that name might not necessarily mean anything to the viewer. So who is this Bradley that you're talking about?
Yeah, Bradley is somebody I encountered early on in my PhD when I was looking at whether reality should ultimately be treated as one or as a plurality. A debate was going on in the contemporary literature, drawing on scientific conceptions of entanglement and some other logical technical arguments. But I was very dissatisfied with it. because it seemed to be presupposing a lot about how this question should be answered. And I came across Bradley as a monist who, again, thought reality is ultimately one. And I was pretty hooked. So he was the most eminent philosopher in Britain at the time, sort of mid to late 19th century. His mentor, he's at Oxford. His mentor was a chap called T.H. Green, who sadly died in his 40s, I think it was, who was making some sort of strong grounds in sort of trying to make sense of what was the evangelical way of interpreting the world at the time. It's an Anglican evangelicalism. It's a little bit different to the American evangelicalism. But trying to make sense of that and a commitment to the reality of ethics, the reality of these sorts of things, given the new understanding of humans that's coming out of the sciences. So given evolutionary theory and the emergence of psychology as a discipline, treating us as non-rational, this sort of stuff. So Bradley was part of that movement called British idealism, and they drew some of the idealism from Germany, but rejected Hegel's main view, which was that reality and thought are one. So this is the stuff I've just been talking about, really. Right. What I learned from Bradley is that you cannot interpret reality without taking seriously the fact that we are subjects, that our perspective and our situatedness. You can't jump out to matter and try and get back consciousness or will or morality. So you start with that. But also recognizing human experience is broader than just thought. And he was psychologically versed. And so for me, he was weaving together all these ideas. Now, his book, Appearance and Reality, is his main metaphysical work. But he also had a 2-volume work on logic. He has a book on ethics. Because of this, because he's interpreting reality in terms of system, what he calls system, ultimately a unity, that things work together and somehow come together. He was the main philosopher. He was recognized as the champion of the British idealist movement, very influential. And basically what happened was G.E. Moore at Cambridge and Bertrand Russell decided that they were going to take him down, basically. So they had debates. Russell and Moore were trying to rid philosophy of idealism as a starting position. Russell was attacking Bradley on the monism pluralism thing. Russell was developing logical atomism, which is the idea that everything can be explained from the tiniest bits logically. He was arguing that reality itself must be a plurality, that the things Bradley couldn't account for. He wrote Principia Mathematica as well, which is, again, looking for the mathematical and logical foundations of mathematics. And so he's involved in a very analytic, technical philosophy project, emulating science, starting with the tiny bits, explaining everything in those terms. So he's attacking Bradley's monism. G.E. Moore attacks his idealism, trying to put in place a kind of a materialism, arguing that idealism is contradictory. Now, philosophy, the kind of the legend goes that Russell and Moore beat Bradley intellectually. That sort of, and that from Russell and Moore's new way of doing philosophy, analytic philosophy was born. They're seen as the sort of founders of the analytic philosophy movement. However, when people more recently have gone and looked at the arguments, it's absolutely not clear at all that Bradley was bested intellectually. There were a series of things that meant that Bradley's influence waned. So one was the World Wars meant that the German foundations of Bradley's metaphysics was seen as suspect. It was seen as somehow involved with the ways in which Germany had gone about its business. Bradley was not that mathematical, and his form of logic was sort of falling behind the new mathematical way that seemed to promise a lot. It seemed to promise that we can explain reality through logical systems. There was the movement in Vienna that had a British offshoot as well that was saying metaphysics is itself meaningless, pointless. We shouldn't do metaphysics at all. So metaphysics is the idea of trying to make sense of reality with reason, not just with experiment and so on. So there's a collection of these things that kind of meant that way was going out of fashion. And there was also just this, I think enthusiasm about where atheism could take us as well, that we didn't need God anymore. We needed to sort of come of age and recognize ourselves, stare in the face our animal nature and the situatedness of everything. And I mean, there's a lot going on in sort of Western culture, right? And I think so. Bradley was trying to harmonize religious sentiment and conviction of the reality of things like meaning and value and sentience and will and truth, but accepting what sciences were telling us, but trying to place scientific truths within a context that saw them as part of a broader understanding of reality and who we are in our place within it, saying yes to it. So he would have totally rejected the sort of religion versus science wars. He would have completely rejected that way of framing it. He'd have completely rejected, if we have time to go into it, the way in which apologetics is done now. I mean, that's why I don't go into the normal apologetic side of things. For him, it's about how do we understand the fundamental nature of things? How does that relate to truth? How does that relate to goodness? How does that relate to our experience of it? How does that ultimately relate to the satisfaction we are seeking when we try to make sense of the world? So all of these ideas are so much more, I think, foundational than issues over who was the first cause and blah, 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 or whatever.
When you kind of gave that description that I guess you got largely from Bradley of sort of there being a exterior sort of ultimate thing that is true, like truth, goodness, beauty, that these are not accidental, arbitrary, or merely a matter of individual perception, but that they're real and sort of out there, like they're actually there. If I heard you right, that is putting language to the question I was fumbling at earlier, where if you just have all of these disassociated people, but no unifying thing that we're all partaking in, like I didn't make up this internal thing that I'm calling good, and you make up your internal thing that you're calling good. Why would those two things have any relationship to each other? How do we possibly measure which one is more or less right, et cetera, et cetera? And that would, I think, also go for truth and also go for beauty, if we're going to talk about beauty as well. And so, but the way that you articulated that, I guess there being a source or a fountainhead that in a sense we're all drinking from in our human experience, that seems, from my non-philosopher puny perspective, to make better sense of the human experience. And when you were saying that reality seems more fundamentally personal than it does than not, that if I remember correctly, was your preferred way of talking about the question of philosophy. What is ultimate reality, rather than does God exist or not? Is, I believe you said, does it seem more like the kind of thing that is fundamentally personal or not, if I heard you right? But I kind of want to lead you into that, describing the difference there.
Yeah, so it does. I think in some ways it's helpful to come to this question having done my best to articulate bits about my view, in that the question, does God exist? If that's the way you think, if you think that's the most important question there is, that's the way to approach the difference between theism and atheism, I think you are severely underappreciating the gravity of what's at stake. Okay? If you think it's whether God exists, it's really not much different to whether you think aliens exist or the Higgs boson exists or something of that sort. You have the idea that reality is parceled up into objects and properties, or entities and properties and so on. And is there this entity, God, in reality? And the way that is played out, if you look at, for example, Graham Oppy's arguments for atheism, it seems to be the framework within which those people engage with that stuff. I mean, I don't know William Lane Craig too much, but certainly if I look at like the Kalam argument, bits and pieces like this, they seem again to suggest we have a theory of the world that we all agree on, pretty much. Do we need to also add in some extra entity called God for that theory to work, right? So we all know that everything that has a beginning has a cause, and we all agree that the universe has a beginning. So that means the universe must have a cause as well, even by your theory. So that cause is God. So for me, that already assumes causation is real and it's a thing out there that connects events. It assumes that time is real. It already assumes all these other concepts that you're taking to be fundamental and fully agreed upon before you even get to the God question. Whereas if you think, no, reality, if the question is instead, what is the deep nature of things? What is the ultimate nature of everything? And if you think everything is ultimately more like a person, but as Bradley would say, super personal, spirit, in all its the complexity of sentience that we experience in fragments and bits and pieces, the entire way in which you understand causation, the entire way in which you understand time is thereby transformed. So, for example, often the way the debate is set out, this is an example I sometimes use, is imagine Richard Dawkins and I sit down and we're discussing ontology, which is the question of what exists. I get my pad of paper, he gets his. We start writing down the things we think exist. And for a while, we're just perfectly still. Oh, yeah, I think chairs exist, so do you. I think atoms exist, so do you. I think blah, 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 blah. And then he puts his pen down, and I go, hang on a minute. I'm going to add on demons. I'm going to add on angels. I'm going to add on heaven. I'm going to add on the Holy Spirit, or whatever. And then the idea is, well, we agree about so much, and now we're just disagreeing about these extra things. I think that is if that is the way in which you set up the question, I think whatever you're proving there is some kind of idealist, some kind of something that is less than God. It has to just be an idea. It has to be a concept. Whereas I think the question is, how do we relate to reality as a whole? Do we relate to reality as though it's something that we are in relationship with here? Am I in relationship with the created world? Am I in relationship with my own felt experience, with my understanding of the world? Do I think the world is talking back to me, drawing me on to pursue truth for the sake of understanding, drawing me on into behaving in more and more aligned in ways of the good, and to try and align my feelings to approve that which is beautiful, and so on? Am I experiencing God speaking to me in my very aesthetic life, speaking to me as I pursue understanding, speaking to me as I try to lead a life? That to me is a posture that's taken towards, it's the starting point from which I understand everything else. It's not an entity to make my existing theory work. So, for example, let's take causation. I have my view on causation it's a relatively mainstream view. It's an agency theory of causation. What it is for one thing to cause another is for the first thing to be a good strategy. It's a good strategy to bring that about if you intend to produce the effect. I got a lot of reasons why it's non-mechanistic. It's an agency-based theory of causation. Now, so my argument would be causation itself does not make sense unless you think agency is fundamental to the world at large. If you think that, you already have agency written into the foundation of all things. You already have something that is far more like God than you do the idea of some finger that knocks over the first domino to set off a chain reaction of causes to bring about the universe or something. So for me, the question of God is the first question. It doesn't pop out the end of what you already accept. It's too revolutionary from that. It's too kind of foundational, fundamental. So I go to metaphysics. I go to trying to better interpret everything else in light of what I feel to be the deepest nature of things. Where do we feel the deepest nature of things? I think the reason I use words like truth, beauty, and goodness is because I think beauty calls to us. There's something so authoritative and powerful about a piece of music that just lifts you out of your situation, calms your spirit, takes you up to the transcendent and sort of wraps you in a warm blanket. Truth, you have these aha moments. Suddenly everything clicks. Your understanding sparks and lights, and it's like, that tastes good. My mind is satisfied by that. That shoots you all off in a whole bunch of other different directions. It's a wonderful experience. How could truth itself, rooted in understanding, not be transcendent? And then, of course, that means I have what's called a degree theoretic notion of truth, saying things like, reality is fundamentally truth, beauty, and goodness is way more true than the truth that there are, I don't know, 173 books on my shelf. I mean, that's true, but it's not satisfying intellectually much. I mean, a bit, right? And then the same with goodness. Goodness is the value of living, the value of action. As we align our lives with the good in a moral dimension, we encounter some kind of satisfaction that transcends. We recognize these things are more real than the passing finitude of our current experience. These are the ways in which we touch on what is most real, what is most fundamental. So to reduce that to some kind of concept that makes your theory work or something like that, it doesn't really do it for me. And this is getting back to Bradley. So Bradley thought that because truth is part of what we're trying to understand when we do metaphysics, we have to be trying to explain the nature of truth. Clearly, what determines a good metaphysical theory from bad metaphysical theory is not truth, right? Because truth is part of what we're trying to do. So he says, what is it we're trying to do when we're trying to understand reality? He thinks we are looking for intellectual satisfaction. So the ultimate judge of any metaphysical theory has to be, how satisfying is it intellectually? It doesn't deny that. Obviously, part of that is affirming the objectivity of truth, which we've talked about. But that objectivity isn't that we say things that match up to some structured way the world is. No, these are true because they are beautiful and good. It's where truth combines with these other things and draws us on and brings life to our understanding and so on.
I could imagine someone just positing truth, goodness, and beauty in their abstraction as ultimate reality. Ultimate reality is just this thing called goodness, this thing called beauty, this thing called truth. And what do you think of John 1? And what do you mean by, what do you think the logos is? And is that actually cogent that the logos became put on flesh and dwelt among us? And this whole idea of, I like the way you put it. You said something along the lines of, why would history be the one discipline or modality that is on kind of a Petersonian view that is like omitted from the conversation of what is deep, meaningful, and true? And so, as you were kind of starting to poke at the Trinitarian view and how that kind of comports with this idea, or at least maybe we might disagree, but it could be interesting, I think, to head in that direction. Because as I hear what you're saying, just to put my cards on the table, I think absolutely yes. Like, reality is truth-filled, beauty-filled, and goodness-filled, not just because we perceive it as such, or we make that up or arbitrarily manifest that, but because that is baked into reality itself. But I would, and I don't know if we would agree here or not, but it'd be fun if we don't, actually, because I would draw a distinction between the creation and the creator. And I would say that, to borrow the language from the Victorian poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, the whole world is charged with the grandeur of God, and it shines out like shining from shook foil. I would say yes to that. But I would still draw a distinction between, I would say, this cup isn't divine, the table isn't divine, the whole system in a sense isn't divine, but it is all declaring something that is true, good, and beautiful about ultimate reality himself, I would say.
Truth, beauty, and goodness could just be these abstract things. Isn't there more to the story than that? Well, I think that if you're interpreting this in the way Plato does, which is the idea that there's this world of the forms out there, there is the form of the good, the form of the beautiful, the form of the true, just as there's a form of the perfect circle, the form of redness itself, and so on, then I would emphatically reject that. This is not a Platonic kind of idea, for exactly the reasons that I've been talking about. To say that is to fall back into this idea that reality is ultimately thought, right? Mm-hmm. Plato's realm of the forms is a purely intellectual realm. These are intellectual entities. Now, if I'm doing metaphysics, as Bradley would put forward, I am trying to explain reality to you using language. I'm trying to communicate thoughts to you. And I'm trying to say the most true things that I can. But part of me doing this is to say, but don't confuse what I am saying as a description for what the thing ultimately is, because my whole point is that reality outstrips what can be described and what could be thought. So by calling it truth, I've also been strongly trying to say that truth is that which draws us beyond when we try to think about things. It's the norm, it's the value, it's what we are aiming at when we think, which I have to give a name to. So I've called it truth. And I think that's the best name we've got, right? But really what I mean by truth is that which makes inquiry worth it, that which distinguishes good thinking from bad thinking, that which distinguishes error from truth. I mean, it's a living force that we experience as the center around which all thinking orbits. It's the thing we posit to make sense of inquiry itself. Similarly with goodness, that is the thing that we are aiming at in our activity, in our doing. I mean, it might not be. You might aim to accumulate as much money as you want. But I would say that if you're living in a way that's not aiming at the good, it is fundamentally dissatisfying to the nature of our, well, the spirit, basically, that which drives and animates us in our activity. Similarly with beauty. So these are not abstract entities. Abstract entities are not real for that purpose. They are instead experienced as the norms and the drives and the values of every sphere of human activity. Okay, so that's that one. I think you talked about the difference between the creation and the created. So I would say yes and no. So I think that from our perspective, the world that we experience as finite centers is not God, because it's finite and it's limited. So I've been using words like, of course, there are falsities. There are things we think that are not true. There are things that we do that are not good. There are things we feel that are not beautiful. But in as much as they lack those things, they equally lack reality. And that's really just a claim about, an affirmation about what the ultimate nature of things is. And that is experienced in terms of what we take to be the norms. So I think, and this is now getting into areas that are a little bit outside of philosophy, and I'm interpreting some of my Christian faith and some of the theology that I know from my philosophical lens. I'm going to admit that, right? I am not coming at this as a theologian or as a biblical scholar. I'm coming at this, I mean, I'm familiar with my Bible, but I'm thinking philosophically. The notion of heaven, for example, I think is like our notion of the ultimate nature of reality. Heaven is a place of pure truth, beauty, and goodness, right? And I think affirming that heaven is real is a way of affirming that that mode of being is more the true nature of things than this passing world of temporality that's passing away and everything in it's passing away. And we're looking for God's kingdom to come and invade the earth and to become fully manifest. It's in seed form at the moment. I mean, so much of the religious language talks this way. You talk about a fall, that there was a perfection from which we've fallen, and so on. That is the way I understand things. When I'm talking about the ultimate nature of reality, I'm talking about the way in which things ought to be. That's the way they're norms. We recognize that our current existence and the world that we encounter is not perfect. But so that's the no bit, creator and creator being differently. The yes bit is saying that, however, in some sense, the world that we're encountering isn't nothing. It's not completely unreal. So it must find its place ultimately in that completion or that consummation when all is said and done and so on. So every act must, in some sense, find its place in a redemptive way. So I don't think God is in the business of cutting things out. I think he's in the business of redeeming everything, that all things are redeemed. This isn't universalism. Don't get me saying things I'm not saying. What I'm saying is that ultimately evil doesn't exist, right? Because
the privation or deprivation.
Right. So at the end of this, all things will be recognized within the context of the whole as playing a role in the ultimate goodness of all things. Every falsity, every error will find its place. And this is the way Bradley tries to explain things like the problem of evil and the problem of error. He recognizes that these are problems with this very kind of positive, optimistic view of the ultimate nature of reality. And what he points to is he says, there's nothing illogical or incoherent about the idea of suffering contributing to pleasure. So you work out, you get sore in your muscles, that kind of makes you feel even better, right? That's a minor example, but that it shows that it's not impossible for pain and suffering to actually, when seen in the context of the whole, recognize to find its place.
Or a flu shot.
Flu shot, right? There's all these different ways. So I think in that sense, I can't really make sense of there being anything independent, entirely independent of God, because then it would have to be a substance. Therefore, it would be capable of maintaining its own existence. It would have to be its own engine of its own being. And I think that God must ultimately be the grounds and the source from which everything finds its place, even though within that we can recognize the distinction between the more real and the less real, the more true and the less true, and so on.
Just for clarity's sake, because I think I'm tracking with you, but what would be the difference between God and heaven on your view?
I've not really thought about it. I think obviously the heaven isn't usually taken or understood in personal terms. It's usually understood in terms of space of interaction. But there is also language in heaven that sort of talks about God pervading the entire place. You know, there is no sun, everything's illuminated by the glory of God, and so on. I believe, and Bradley doesn't, by the way, but I do believe in the continuation of conscious experience after death. But there's very little to work with on what that's like, other than from a Christian perspective, looking at Christ after the resurrection and so on. For me, heaven is about I interpret heaven in the same way as an affirmation of the ultimate justice, beauty, truth, and goodness woven into reality. So I take heaven to be saying that the finitude of our experience on earth cannot be the whole story. Otherwise, reality is not just. Reality is not beautiful. So it's and actually, when you look at when heaven and the notion of the afterlife arose in Jewish thinking, it was exactly for this reason, right? It was because there were faithful, devout Jews that, in service to the law, got viciously slaughtered and desecrated by the Greeks, I think it was. And so they're like, this can't be the end for these righteous Jews. God must see justice done. They must be resurrected, and because the good don't always get what they deserve. So I think I interpret heaven not in a scientific way. Well, it must be some literal real place or real realm. That it may be, but I don't see why. I don't think that's the reason it was originally talked about. I think that heaven, affirming the existence of heaven and in its reality over this world, is affirming the greater reality of the kinds of things I'm talking about. But I think.
But would you agree though that they're like? I guess what I'm getting at, and if this is where we disagree, then there's nothing wrong with that. We're allowed, But I think it's important to understand. So on one hand, you have the caricature of God as this like grandfatherly character with a white beard in the sky sitting on a cloud, which we're both totally rejecting. We're saying like that's the materialist problem. The classic Laplace builds this system of the solar system and it goes, there's no God in it. That type of an idea that we're both totally rejecting and saying that's a straw man. That's silly. That's not what anybody means by God. On the other hand, I think that there is a potential mistake of blurring the lines between like heaven and God or earth and God, because I would agree with you. Heaven would be a place where the perfect is made real, like the goodness is fully instantiated, whereas now it's things are not quite as they ought to be, and the same with beauty and the same with truth. Everything in that arena is as it ought to be, is as it as we would hope that it would be. But I don't think that, my view is, I don't believe that like heaven, I don't believe that space-time, matter, and energy are eternal. And I don't believe that heaven created them. I think heaven, in some sense, I agree with you. I don't know exactly, but in some sense is forthcoming. But I think that in terms of a grounding for these things that you're talking about, truth, goodness, and beauty, there has to be some. I basically define or understand God as the source, the architect, the personality who is goodness, is truth, is beauty, but is also personal. He's not the same thing as heaven. He's not the same thing as he's not embedded into matter like panpsychism would say. Consciousness is embedded into, or he's not a property of the material world. I also don't think that he's merely the construct that we use to sort of drape over top of mental proper, like in an idealism sense. I think that he's an actual, like he has a will, he has a heart, not a physical heart, but he actually, the way that we are different from the chair that we're sitting on is telling us something about what he is like. We have agency, we have personality, we perceive beauty, goodness, truth. I think all of the things that are human unique on a biblical worldview are the things that we can look to as clues to what he's like. We're in his image. We're a certain way. He's more so that way. He is a greater, not just a bigger human, but we are derivative of his nature. So, and I would say, and tell me if this is all, feel free to, it'll be fun. All in a way that is unique. I guess that's the point I want to make. My view is that humans are uniquely in his image, and the things that we can look to and say, it's weird that the tables aren't having this conversation about reality, and we are. That, I think, is a clue to what God is like. And so emphasizing the idea really of personhood. That's the main point I'm trying to, that I want to posit here, is I believe it's very important that we understand God is personal and therefore relatable, because I think the whole enchilada with the whole human experiment and the reason that anything exists other than him at all is in order for that relationship to take place, that we're created in such a way that we can actually relate to him. Like you said, we have reason, but he has revelation, and reason and revelation are supposed to, they're designed to connect together so that we're propelled into the truth himself. That's what I believe. But what do you think?
So first of all, remember, I don't think there is a chair. I don't think that when you talk about creation or the world, maybe we're thinking about different things. I'm not thinking about just plants, trees, and buildings, right? I'm thinking about the sum total of human experience. It involves will, it involves aesthetic experience, and so on. So I think that God is that which we experience as the norm within every sphere, right? So the degree to which I try to understand the world, then the world of my senses, so that the restricted idea of the world that we get in science, then I'm encountering God as my understanding grows, and as I encounter truth, that's encountering God intellectually, encounter God aesthetically as I gaze and wonder at the beauty in a flower, and so on. Mm-hmm. Okay, so God is so for me, the world that God created is not the material world, or what we're used to calling the material world. I would interpret and there are lots of reasons for this, I would interpret the Genesis account as the creation of consciousness as well. It's a creation that we each individually experience as infants coming into the world. If you look at things get structured, they initially are chaotic. Some of the stuff I talked about, how our experience grows out. Okay, so then what is heaven? Heaven, if you're talking about heaven as a landscape that has trees and rivers and stuff, so if we're taking the kind of pictorial language in Ezekiel and Revelation and so on, as though it's like this world but shinier, more gold, right? That is not God, right? Because that's only an idealized vision of a fragment of human experience, what we perceive through our five senses. But look at some of the language you get in the Bible. Look at the Lord's Prayer, right? Our Father in heaven, holy is your name. Very different. Your nature is far above ours. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So if we're taking heaven to be not merely a beautiful landscape, we're also taking it to be the place where the gap between will and reality is closed.
Mm-hmm.
So we experience our will as, I want something. You only will for things that are not already actual, that are not manifest in reality. And you try to realize that, bring that into reality by doing things. You are trying to connect. So heaven is the place where that gap between what is willed and what is closed.
Would you agree that there's also a character in that prayer called, in that case, the language uses Father, who is the one who possesses the will that is playing itself out in that way where the gap is closed, but the Father has a will that is being done in a closed gap way in heaven, or would you want to erase the Father out of the prayer?
I'm not erasing the Father out of the prayer. I think. Well, look, I think there are also just different understandings of heaven and eschatology and everything playing in here. I suppose I would lean more towards the idea of not heaven being a separate realm to the earth, but the prayer that heaven becomes manifest on the new heavens and the new earth, right? Where those gaps are healed up, the gaps between what God wills and what is. So if we're understanding, so our Father, I think this is an appeal to recognizing us as made in His image, as the source. God is the source from which we have come, recognizing therefore that it is our purpose to become more and more like Him. And then the prayer is therefore for God's space, for that place where God's nature is manifest more purely, His glory is more evident, His will is more done to become manifest in the earth. That's the way I understand the idea of the kingdom being here in seed form, and we are seeking for that to become fully manifest. And when I say remember on earth, I don't mean in this material world, blah, blah. I just mean that within the human experience and the divine experience, that gap is closed. That it's really the language of asking for the Holy Spirit as the seed form of God within the soul, within the human heart, to grow and manifest so that we become manifest, that image of God through taking on His attributes and so on. So I'm still trying to think whether we agree or disagree.
I essentially understand John 1 to be saying that there is this, that God is, I think it's Aquinas says, God is always previous. He's always prior. So there's this, I am that I am. His existence is equal to His essence, God. And at a certain point in time, He enters into, like, He comes to planet Earth. Basically, in the body of in the form of Jesus, and in that sense, sort of the logos, which is, I think we would agree about that, but actually puts on flesh is the language, puts on flesh and walks among us. And elsewhere in Scripture, it's said that He is the image of the invisible God, which I think that's a really brilliant idea. He in His sort of human perceptual form, where He is actually speaking Aramaic in a way that can be understood. He's on earth. He's on a horizontal plane, and He's giving us the clearest picture of what God is like, which I think, for one, just briefly, ties into what you're saying about goodness, truth, and beauty in a really powerful way, because He is the ultimate human in those areas, clearly. But I think the reason for that is that He's not just another person in the image of the source or in the image of God, but He is the source actually instantiating Himself into what is secondary to Himself. Whether we talk, a materialist will call it right. So like there's the William Lane Craig, like it's matter is secondary. And you might say, no, like in an idealist sense, would you say that there is anything secondary? Or do you think it's all, like, do you have in your view a state or time when there is God apart from any other thing, like apart from any what would normally be called creation.
I think I agree with your intuition about the prior, but I interpret prior not as in previous in time, but prior as in more fundamental, more basic, more real.
Okay.
So really then the entire position I've been putting forward to you is saying that, yeah, truth is something to which our intellect has fallen from, and we're trying to get back to it. It is prior. It's the grounds from which we have come, from which we have fallen. And so we're seeking to get back to it. So I think I probably agree with you, but would probably describe it in other terms.
Okay.
Do you want me to go John 1?
Yeah. I want to hear John 1. Yeah, let's go there.
So I would say, I think John 1 is fascinating. What you have there is you have, first of all, the logos, the Greek logos, which has always been linked with the idea of language and thought and structure. And the idea of the logos was all things are made through him. Now, before we get to the person Jesus Christ, which comes later, the logos, I think, is very much tied in with the sort of theism that I'm presenting, and it's very much tied in with the forms of experience I was talking about as well, that we have this raw encounter with the world that isn't structured. It's this linked actually to Genesis, I think 1:1, the tohu vabohu, the void and waste, before with the Spirit hovering over the water. You get this idea of this sort of chaotic, unformed sort of being, right? But then the word comes, separating light from darkness, separating land from sky from beneath, from the waters, and then the land from the sea, and so on. So the logos and the word comes in to separate and categorize, this is here and this is here, and set the limits and no further, and so on. So the logos is that which structures some kind of underlying raw being. And that's exactly the metaphysics I'm talking to you about. We have these two modes of experience of the world. So that which structures is linguistic, is intellectual, it's knowable. That's the logos, the word logic and word, all tied in that Greek notion. Now, what John is saying is that structural manifestation of the underlying nature of being that we recognize as being that which frames all that is, has manifest in a personal form in the life of a particular individual in history. So far in our whole conversation, I have not been arguing for Christianity. I've just been arguing for a metaphysical view that I would link with theism. Christianity is an additional thing. It's a claim, a historical claim about the nature of a particular person that we would say is the ideal or potentially perfect, I don't know exactly how you might use that word, manifestation of the deep nature of the universe in human form. I think that's what John is getting at. Now, as a Christian, I'm going to affirm that. And what that means then is that this breaks the Platonic abstractness of the good. We can recognize the good in our own life and how it manifests in our own life. And as we're driven to live a certain way that is morally satisfying and claims an authority on our moral life, I think that's what we experience in a real account of morality. But what is that like? Well, we now have a manifestation of what the good looks like, lived in human flesh within the finite confines of a body of flesh and blood in Jesus Christ. And so Christianity affirms, if you want to know what good looks like in the push and pull and the nitty gritty and the complexity of a life lived here among us, Jesus is the representation. So my Trinity is that God the Father, or God transcendent, is kind of the God I've been talking about most of the time, right? That we experience in the values in the whole of our experience. Jesus Christ is God encountered among us in the public nature as an entity that we can relate to and engage with, that is one on a similar sort of level to us. It's human as well. And then the Holy Spirit is the encounter with God we find within ourselves as that which can be the transformative power of those values to enable us to become transformed in our thinking, in our feeling, in our action. And so in some ways, I think, getting back to the early conversation, heaven is when our felt world has been fully taken over by Holy Spirit so that we feel heaven as well. So heaven is part of our felt experience, or God is part of our felt experience as if it's from outside, in the same way we encounter truth and goodness as well. So last thing, we mentioned about Peterson. So I think what I said to you was, and this might help make sense of why I wouldn't wholeheartedly say, oh no, creation is one thing, God is another. Peterson said in this interview once, he was asked, like, do you think there was a resurrection, or do you think the resurrection was true? And he said something like, I think the resurrection is like more true than true, or like when the deepest truth. Death and resurrection is a part of natural life cycles. It's a part of psychology. It's a part of all of these sorts of things. And I think the interviewer was a bit frustrated and said something like, yeah, but what I want to ask you is, if you could go back in time and you're staring at the tomb in, in Israel at the time, would you see a body walk out? Right. In other words, is it historically true or literally true, as people say? And Peterson is sort of, at that time anyway, was sort of hedging a bit. And as an idealist, I'd want to say, what's so special about history? Like, I think it's the materialist or scientific intuition that thinks reality is where the world is at. It's in the sequence of events through time. It's in how the laws interact. That's reality. Our way of thinking about it is layered on top, and a point of thinking is to kind of match that reality, and that's truth. Everything else is poetry or something, and it's the idealist is rejecting that entire way of thinking. Reality is not at what plays out in history. Reality is in the experience we have of the world, both in idealized ways and in the reality we encounter. In that case, if we are finding death and resurrection as the fundamental way in which we have to understand and interpret everything, if we're finding it here, there, and everywhere in all of our thinking, why wouldn't you find it in history? You'd expect to find it in history as well. It's just another domain of understanding, another domain of reality. And if you do that and you think, well, since we're finding death and resurrection everywhere else, maybe we should look to see if it happened in history. As soon as you do that, there's a pretty good candidate, right? Which would be Jesus Christ. So I think that this way of thinking makes Christianity a kind of a or a kind of a really natural step to take. And then what you're thinking is, given that I have this intellectual way of understanding the deep nature of things, and given that if I want to see what that might look like in a lived out human person, if I'm going to try and copy that, there's this guy, Jesus of Nazareth, that loads of people say is what it looks like to live in perfect harmony with the deep nature of things. And that's what I think is miracles manifest. He can control the waves and control the mountain because he is what we would say in philosophy, a particular that instantiates the universal values. He is the whole intellectual ideas manifest in a particular concrete person, right, that we can interact with and engage. So he then demonstrates to us what goodness looks like, what a life of beauty looks like, a life of truth looks like. And then that's where Christianity comes in, and you can Christologically then understand what goodness, truth, and beauty are via understanding what they looked like or were manifest in the person Jesus Christ. So that's what I think John's getting at in John 1, that the logos, the way of understanding categories and that appeals to the intellect, took on flesh and dwelt among us, and that enabled us to get a grip on the nature of the invisible God. It was God made manifest in the flesh. Yeah, I think those views can come apart. You could take the theistic metaphysics bit separate to the Christianity bit, but as I say, I think the Christianity follows quite naturally in that worldview, and it certainly helped me make sense of my Christianity as well.
One reason I really have enjoyed this conversation and talking with you is that your knowledge of sort of the philosophical terrain from the 19th century forward, I think, is really helpful for people to sort of see what is on the table. And then as we've kind of gotten into ultimately like the incarnation of ultimate reality in the person of Jesus, I just hope for someone maybe listening to this whole thing that the context and the groundwork and all of this that you've laid is at least helpful in the sense of explaining how that is a far more plausible concept in light of this whole conversation than it is if you, again, assume just a physicalist model of the universe. And then there's this one guy, this one time who died and then came back to life. I mean, give me a break. That's absurd, right? And so I hope that this is at least helpful in terms of kind of putting proper weight to the different schools of thought that exist. And then, and I think you've done a phenomenal job of kind of walking down that path of philosophy over the last, I guess, maybe 100, 150 years or so. And like I said, there's a lot more that we could unpack from here. But any last thoughts or anything, I guess, that you want to add at the closing here?
Yeah, well, if I could be rude, I'll make a little pitch for where people can go to learn a
Great.
bit more.
No, please.
Yeah, so I mean, I have a YouTube channel. I talk about some of this stuff on there. I don't usually go quite so heavy on the theism side. I keep things generally philosophical. So that's just Dr. Nathan Hawkins. You can use my name. What I am trying to do, though, is if there are people who want to understand this stuff more deeply and rigorously, I've got a Patreon page that you can find where I am monthly doing conversations on particular articles or papers that people can join in discussions and ask me questions, and we can hash this out a bit more, as well as I'm trying to build a bit of a community. So, for example, next month, we're looking at an article by F.H. Bradley entitled Faith, where he's trying to explain what he thinks faith is, more broadly than just religious faith, but how faith works in all areas of thinking. So, I mean, if that sort of stuff sounds interesting to anybody, I'd suggest do that. It'd be great to have you with us, and I'd appreciate your support as well. But otherwise, it is quite hard to find this stuff. I mean, I would recommend reading some of the British idealist thinkers, but it's hard going. I mean, it was written a long time ago. It's not that familiar. You need a lot of background to it. And I'm still trying to unpack a lot of it. But I can just say that it has been transformative to my own faith. And what you said at the end, I think, is really a big part of it. That I've always been a Christian. I've always believed, but I didn't understand what it was that I believed. It was really just something that I couldn't let go of. More correctly, I think it was something that had a hold of me, but I was seeking to understand it. And I think when I started to reinterpret and understand how he makes sense of everything in a way that's historically grounded, rigorously intellectual, then things like believing in resurrection is not an aberration. It's a natural outworking of how things are. And that is incredibly rich and powerful. And you'd said early on, I think our culture is hungry for something like this. It's hungry for something where we can place values, moral values, and meaning in at the ground floor of our way of understanding everything. And to do that, I think you've got to be idealist. Idealism for me is the only metaphysics on the table that could at all support the weight of what we need supported, right? And in a way that I think contributes to a religious outlook, because my religious outlook before was basically materialist. It's basically a materialist conception of the world. And then I believe, but when I die, I disappear to this other place, right? Whereas I think if rigorous metaphysical view can kind of integrate, then it transforms the way in which you understand the religious account as well. So yeah, that would be my last thoughts.
Briefly put, when you say that there's a pattern of death and resurrection, and that's the norm, and then why would history be the exception to the rule? Why are we privileging history as something that doesn't get to participate in that, that thing that Jordan Peterson is referencing? What are other examples of that? Or in case someone's like, what do you mean death and resurrection is nowhere? There's no such a thing anywhere. And it's not, it's nothing at all. Like it doesn't exist. Like, how would you, like, I guess, what do you mean when you say not only does this exist in history in this one case, but it exists all over the place at different levels? What are we talking about there?
So I have to say, this is something that Peterson was talking about to do, I think, with Jungian psychology, that the concepts of death and rebirth and resurrection are all over the place. I mean, so I'm not. I mean, I'm the concept guy, right? So yeah. So I will. What I would say is that, I mean, obviously, it appears in seed time and harvest and the rhythms of nature and our own experience of having children and so on. So it is a part of that. But my pitch, I think, from my metaphysics for taking there to be a manifestation in the world would be more along the lines of what John 1 is getting at, which is that there's debates. Could you think there could be a color, for example, that exists as a form, that there is some pluginous, but nothing has that color? I don't think so. I don't think it makes any sense to think there can be these universals that are nowhere manifested in a particular.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the case, and if I'm affirming the ultimate nature of truth, beauty, and goodness, and I'm affirming the ultimate unity of reality because I'm a monist, then I have to say there exists a unity of truth, beauty, and goodness. That's a universal idea that applies generally to the whole of reality. So I think it must also appear in particular form in reality. And if I'm saying that's also best understood as personal, but more, it's the transcendent personal, as that which draws me in my finite, fallen, failed experience. And I'm saying it goes beyond that. It's infinite in nature, it's perfected, and it's fully unified and at one with the world and all that is. Well, if that's that means that I should look for a particularization of that, and then Jesus would be a good candidate for that.
Got it. Okay, that's awesome.